A retired Navy SEAL thought the war was long behind him. Until one night, he heard a faint whimper beneath the storm. Under the flickering porch light, half buried in snow, lay an old German shepherd, soaked and trembling. Around its neck hung a cracked leather collar, the words barely visible. Ghost, K9 Unit 47. When Ethan knelt beside the dog, it didn't snarl or shy away. It simply looked at him, with the weary eyes of a soldier who'd seen too much and waited too long to come home. What followed would uncover a secret buried by the fallen and remind the living that faith still breathes in the loyal. So tell me, would you have stopped? Comment below, and if you still believe in miracles born from loyalty, hit subscribe. The winter night in the Montana mountains was the kind that swallowed sound itself. The wind screamed between the pines, bending their dark silhouettes beneath a sky split by the white fury of snow. Inside a small log cabin near the edge of the ridge, Ethan Cole sat in silence, his breath forming faint clouds above a half-empty mug of coffee gone cold. Ethan was a man of 38, tall and broad-shouldered, his once square military posture softened by the quiet years. His face bore the rugged beauty of a man who had seen too much, the kind that no mirror could soften. A faint scar traced along his jawline, cutting through a short beard peppered with early gray. His hair, dark and unkempt, fell slightly over his brow, shadowing eyes that once glimmered with confidence, but now carried the dull reflection of regret. A Navy SEAL veteran, Ethan had spent 15 years in service, trained to act without hesitation. But war leaves strange ghosts behind, and his had followed him home. He lived alone now, the cabin his refuge from the noise of the world. A man who had chosen solitude not because he wanted peace, but because he didn't believe he deserved it. The storm outside deepened, hammering the wooden walls with icy fists. When the lights flickered, Ethan sighed and set down his cup. Generator again, he muttered to himself, pulling on his heavy coat. The fabric creaked as he zipped it up, and he reached for his flashlight hanging by the door. Outside, the world was white chaos. Snow whipped against his face, sharp as sand, biting into the lines of his skin. He trudged through knee-deep drifts toward the shed, where the generator sputtered like a dying beast. As he knelt to check the fuel line, something faint tugged at the edge of his hearing, a sound too soft to belong to the storm. At first, he ignored it. The wind could play tricks, especially in the mountains. But there it was again, a low, trembling whimper, thin as breath, yet desperate enough to cut through the howl of the blizzard. Ethan froze, frowning, every nerve sharpened by instinct, honed over years in hostile zones. He turned off the flashlight, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, from behind the old horse stable near the rear of the property. He moved toward it, each step slow, cautious. The beam of his flashlight swept across snow-covered crates, the frozen fence line, the skeletal outline of an old wagon, and then it caught movement. Beneath the rusted metal of a discarded trash bin, a shape quivered against the ground. Ethan's stomach tightened. He crouched low and saw it clearly now. A German shepherd, old and soaked to the bone, fur matted into clumps of ice. Its chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, and the whimper that came next was more a sigh than a cry. Ethan knelt beside it, the snow stinging his face. "Hey there. Easy," he said softly, his voice instinctively dropping to the same calm tone he had used with K9 units during deployment. The dog didn't snarl or shrink away. It simply blinked once, eyes dull with exhaustion but still aware, eyes that once might have burned bright amber, but now were clouded with age. Ethan slipped off his coat and draped it over the trembling body. The weight of the animal in his arms was shockingly light. As he lifted it, he could feel the bones through the wet fur. Inside the cabin, the heat from the fireplace wrapped around them like a second skin. Ethan laid the shepherd on an old wool blanket near the fire, steam rising as the ice melted from its fur. He moved carefully, drying the dog with a towel, murmuring without thought, "You've been out there too long, haven't you?" The dog's ear flicked faintly at the sound of his voice. As he worked, Ethan noticed a strip of worn leather around the dog's neck. The collar was cracked, stiff with age. He wiped away the grime until faint letters appeared, carved by a soldier's hand long ago. Ghost, K9 Unit 47. For a moment, Ethan simply stared. His pulse stumbled, and the room seemed to tilt. Unit 47. The name struck like a buried landmine. That was Lieutenant Daniel Ward's unit, his best friend, his brother in arms. Daniel had been 2 years older than Ethan, leaner, always with a restless spark in his gray-blue eyes. He'd been the kind of man who could make an entire squad laugh on the edge of death. Ethan could still see him, the crooked grin, the sandy hair always falling into his face, the stubborn optimism that had both inspired and infuriated him. Daniel had died 6 years ago when their convoy hit an explosive during an operation overseas. Only fragments were found. The entire team, Unit 47, had been listed as K5EA, but there had been whispers, classified notes, and Ethan had always felt something in the report didn't fit. Now, staring at that name burned into the collar, the whispers roared back like ghosts unburied. Ethan rubbed a hand across his face, fighting the sudden ache in his chest. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. His gaze fell on the dog again. Ghost. That was what Daniel had called his K9 partner. Ethan had met the shepherd once, years ago at the base in Coronado. A magnificent creature then. Young, fierce, with a coat the color of wet sand and eyes sharp as glass. He remembered Daniel saying, "He's smarter than half the unit, maybe smarter than me." Ethan had laughed then, but now the same dog lay before him, aged, fragile, yet unmistakably the same soul. Ethan sat back, watching the firelight dance across Ghost's body. The dog stirred slightly, letting out a faint, rasping exhale, as though it recognized him, not by face, but by the quiet rhythm of a soldier's presence. The moment hung between them, fragile and strange. Ethan felt something twist inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Tenderness. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly through the coarse fur. "You made it home," he whispered. The words caught in his throat. Outside, the wind screamed harder, but inside the cabin the world had gone still. Ethan leaned back against the armchair, the fire's warmth crawling slowly through his cold bones. He thought of Daniel, of laughter under desert stars, of missions that went right and the ones that didn't. He thought of promises made in passing. If one of us doesn't make it back, the other keeps the light on. Ethan had never believed in omens, but tonight felt different. Maybe Ghost hadn't just stumbled into his yard. Maybe this was the light that Daniel had asked him to keep. The clock ticked softly in the corner, marking time like a heartbeat. Ethan poured a bowl of warm water and slid it beside Ghost, who lifted his head weakly and lapped at it. The motion was slow but steady, determined, the same way a soldier drinks after a long march. "Good boy," Ethan murmured. He didn't smile often these days, but his lips curved faintly now, almost uncertain how to hold the expression. He sat beside the shepherd, the fire crackling low. Ghost closed his eyes, breathing shallow but even. The scars beneath his fur were old, some surgical, some brutal. Ethan recognized them all. He had carried the same kind across his soul. Hours passed. Outside, the storm began to ease, the fury of it softening into a steady whisper. Ethan dozed in the chair, waking only when the embers flared. The dog shifted, sighing in his sleep, and for an instant Ethan could almost hear Daniel's voice again. The easy drawl, the laughter that once made war feel survivable. He stood and placed another log on the fire. The light caught on Ghost's collar, making the faded inscription glint like a heartbeat. Ethan stared at it a long time, his throat tightening with a mix of disbelief and reluctant hope. "If you're really him," he murmured, "then you came back for a reason." Outside, dawn was still hours away, but the wind had calmed. The world was buried under silence and snow, untouched, waiting. Inside the cabin, a man and a dog, both ghosts of wars past, breathed the same quiet air. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift in the stillness. Not peace? Not yet. But perhaps the faint, impossible beginning of it. He pulled a blanket over Ghost and sat back down beside the fire. His eyes lingered on the flame's reflection in the old shepherd's clouded eyes, and he whispered the same words he had spoken to Daniel on their last mission. Words half prayer, half promise. "I've got you." And in the small log cabin buried beneath the Montana snow, the storm outside faded to a whisper, as though the mountains themselves were listening. The morning came slow and gray, blanketing the Montana Valley in a hush of snow. The storm had passed, but silence still clung to the air, thick and heavy as frost. Inside the cabin, the fireplace hummed softly, filling the wooden walls with a sleepy warmth. Ethan Cole sat near the hearth, sleeves rolled up, his dark hair still unkempt from the restless night. He hadn't slept much. The image of the old German shepherd lying near his fire haunted him. Those cloudy eyes that had once belonged to a soldier's companion, the name on the collar that tied him to a ghost of the past. Ethan's hands were steady now, the way they always were when focus overtook emotion. Years in the SEALs had taught him to compartmentalize, to fold grief into function. He reached for the leather collar resting on the table. The words, "Ghost, K9 Unit 47, were still faintly visible beneath the cracks, glimmering when the firelight caught the metal buckle. His thumb brushed the stitching on the underside. It was rougher than standard issue, the kind of crude field repair that shouldn't have lasted this long. He frowned, leaning closer. Something about the seam didn't look right. It ran slightly uneven, not like a quick patch from a handler, but tight and deliberate, as if it hid something. Ethan retrieved his old combat knife from the drawer, the same blade he'd carried through sandstorms and firefights. Its steel edge still bore faint scratches, reminders of another life. He set the collar flat on the table and made a slow incision along the seam. The smell of old leather filled the air. Beneath the surface, something small and rigid clinked against the knife. Ethan's pulse jumped. He widened the cut carefully, prying the layers apart until a tiny black chip, barely larger than a coin, slid free into his palm. It was encased in waterproof resin, military grade. He turned it over under the light, the edges scuffed but intact. For a long time he just stared, heart hammering softly against his ribs. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had hidden it there, someone who knew that Ghost might be the only one capable of carrying it out alive. "Jesus, Danny," he whispered under his breath, setting the chip on the table. The name felt foreign on his tongue now, like a word from a language he no longer spoke. He walked to the storage cabinet and pulled out an old rugged laptop, its surface scratched and the Navy SEAL insignia long faded. Dust scattered across the table as he placed it down. The hinges creaked when he flipped it open. He connected the chip to a small, outdated data reader, equipment he hadn't touched in years but had never thrown away. Old habits die hard. The machine hummed, then the screen flickered to life, green code lines racing across a black background. Ethan leaned in, eyes narrowing as the system decrypted itself, bypassing the legacy firewalls he once knew too well. After several seconds, a single phrase appeared, stark and chilling in its simplicity. Operation Black Frost, classified. The words froze him where he sat. For a heartbeat, he could only stare at the glowing letters, as if they might vanish if he blinked. Black Frost. The sound of it dragged him backward through time. He remembered the briefing room, sterile light, maps spread across steel tables, the smell of coffee and gun oil. Lieutenant Daniel Ward, his best friend, sitting across from him, grinning as he tapped a pen against his knee. "If this goes south, Ethan," he'd said with that half-smile, "you better be the one writing my eulogy." He'd laughed then, the kind of laugh only men who'd already made peace with death could give. Ethan had rolled his eyes, but inside he'd made the promise anyway. That mission had gone dark. Communications severed. No recovery team. The official report labeled it as a containment failure during Arctic weapons testing. But Ethan had read between the lines. No bodies recovered, files sealed under executive order. Now the name was here again, burning across his screen in a cabin buried by snow. His throat tightened. He typed in one of the old override codes, hands trembling as old instincts took over. The laptop protested, but the screen shifted, revealing fragmented files, encrypted logs, partial coordinates, transmission stamps from 6 years ago. A dull sound broke his focus. Ghost had lifted his head, watching him. The shepherd's eyes, fogged with age yet oddly aware, met his. There was something unnerving in that gaze, as if the dog knew exactly what Ethan had found. "You were there," Ethan murmured. "You saw it, didn't you?" Ghost gave a soft whine, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. The motion stirred a strange ache in Ethan's chest. He'd seen that same look on the battlefield too many times, the look of a soldier who couldn't speak but understood everything. He turned back to the screen. One line caught his attention among the scrambled data. Black Ridge Facility, Northern Quadrant. He frowned. The name stirred faint recognition. Black Ridge. He had heard that once, years ago, in a classified briefing. It had been a remote mountain outpost, supposedly decommissioned after a series of covert research operations. Yet, something in his gut told him it had never truly been shut down. He scribbled the coordinates onto a notepad. His handwriting was rigid, controlled, but the pressure of the pen tore slightly through the paper. The numbers matched the northern edge of Montana's frozen ridges, days away even by snowmobile. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The cabin creaked around him. The wind outside had quieted, leaving only the faint crackle of fire and the rhythmic breathing of Ghost. Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to still the storm inside his mind. Why had Daniel's unit been sent there? And what could be so dangerous that the entire operation was erased? His thoughts spiraled to darker places. The whispers about bioweapons, about experimental K9 programs that blurred the line between intelligence and instinct. He'd dismissed those rumors once. Now, with Ghost lying before him, very much alive after 6 years, he wasn't so sure. The dog suddenly let out a low, guttural growl, ears twitching toward the window. Ethan froze, listening. The woods were quiet. Still, his instincts screamed caution. He rose and crossed to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. Nothing but snow and trees. Yet the unease lingered, the kind that lives in a soldier's bones long after the war is over. He turned back toward Ghost, his voice steady but soft. "It's just us now, boy. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out." The shepherd blinked once, slow and deliberate, before laying his head down again. The faint crackle of embers filled the silence. Ethan shut the laptop and slipped the chip into his pocket, close to his chest. Whatever Operation Black Frost had been, it wasn't over, and for reasons he didn't yet understand, fate had brought its last surviving witness to his door. Outside, the light shifted across the snowfields, a brief shimmer breaking through the clouds. Ethan stood by the window, watching it with a soldier's stillness. Somewhere out there, the truth waited, cold, buried, and patient. Inside the cabin, Ghost stirred again, letting out a soft huff before drifting into sleep. Ethan looked at the dog, then at the faint glow of the dying fire. He didn't know whether to be grateful or afraid. All he knew was that this time, he wouldn't run from the ghosts that followed him. He would face them, whatever they had become. The wind howled again that night, clawing at the cabin walls like a restless spirit. The world outside was a blur of white and shadow, snowflakes whipping sideways through the bitter dark. Inside, Ethan Cole sat hunched over the glow of his laptop, the faint blue light reflecting off his sharp, stubbled jaw. His face was taut with focus, the muscles in his neck rigid as he typed, decrypting line after line of fractured code. The soft hum of the generator filled the silence, mingling with the crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. Across the room, Ghost, the old German shepherd, lay curled near the hearth. His ears twitched restlessly. Even in his age, the instincts of a K9 soldier hadn't dulled. His nose flared slightly at each shift of wind that slipped through the cracks of the wooden walls. Ethan glanced at him, sensing the tension but saying nothing. His mind was buried deep in the encrypted data he had pulled from the chip. Strings of characters danced across the screen, command lines, coordinates, encrypted files labeled B47, internal and do not access. Ethan's pulse quickened. He'd managed to unlock fragments, enough to know that whatever Operation Black Frost was, it had been wiped from every known military server. Only ghosts and secrets remained. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion pulling at the corners of his eyes. "Come on," he muttered, tapping at the keyboard. "Show me something real." Then, a faint sound broke through the rhythm of his keystrokes, a low hum that didn't belong. Ethan froze. The wind outside shifted, carrying with it the distant purr of an engine. He looked up sharply. Through the frosted window, two beams of light cut through the snow, crawling up the mountain road toward the cabin. He checked the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. No one sane drove this deep into the range at midnight. The headlights drew closer, their glow painting the snowdrifts in long, trembling shadows. Ethan's heart rate slowed, steady, deliberate. His soldier's instincts took control, every sense sharpening to a blade. Ghost stirred, rising from the floor with a low growl, his fur bristling along his spine. "Yeah, I see it too," Ethan whispered. He shut the laptop with a quiet click, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The only light came from the dim, flickering embers. The SUV's engine cut out. Silence pressed against the walls. Then came the sound of boots crunching in snow, slow and methodical, circling the cabin. Ethan reached for his sidearm, a Beretta M9 still oiled and clean despite years of disuse, and moved toward the window. Peering through the narrow gap in the curtain, he saw them. 3 men, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark tactical coats. Their movements were practiced, professional. The leader, a man with a shaved head and a thick black beard, raised a gloved hand, signaling to the others. his breath plumed white in the cold. Ethan's mind ran cold and precise. They're not police, not locals. Private security, maybe. Contractors. The sound of metal scraping reached him. One of the men was at the front door, working at the lock with a tool. Ethan took a slow breath, every motion controlled. "We've got company," he whispered. Ghost's growl deepened, barely audible, but full of warning. "Go," Ethan said softly. "Back exit?" He crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing his heavy coat, flashlight, and small survival pack from the hook near the door. As he reached the rear exit, the front lock gave way with a sharp metallic crack. The door flew open, wood splintering against the wall. Ethan didn't wait. He pushed open the back door and slipped into the storm. Ghost bounded ahead, his paws sinking into the fresh snow. The freezing air bit into Ethan's lungs, but adrenaline dulled the pain. Behind them, a shout pierced the night. Then the first gunshot rang out, muffled but close. Bullets tore into the side of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Ethan ducked low, sprinting toward the line of pines at the edge of the property. Ghost veered left, cutting through the trees with surprising agility for his age. The snow glowed faintly under the moonlight, turning every shadow into a potential target. "Keep moving," Ethan hissed. Another burst of gunfire echoed, the rounds thudding into tree trunks, showering them with powdery snow. He hit the ground behind a fallen log, chest heaving. Ghost crawled beside him, panting, his breath fogging the air. Through the swirling snow, Ethan caught glimpses of the men advancing with flashlights. Their beams swept the forest like searchlights, slicing through the dark. "They're trained," he murmured. "They're tracking us." He drew a deep breath, calculating distances. He knew the terrain. He'd lived here long enough to map every ridge and hollow. If he could reach the cliffs near the East Pass, there was a network of caves that hunters sometimes used for shelter. "This way," he said, motioning to Ghost. They moved in silence, weaving through trees as the snow thickened into a curtain. The cold gnawed at his fingers, but Ethan barely felt it. His world had narrowed to the sound of pursuit, the crunch of boots, the click of safeties, the quiet curse of frustration as the storm swallowed their trail. Ghost ran ahead, his instincts leading the way. Twice he stopped, ears perked, then changed direction. Ethan followed without hesitation. Whatever had been done to this dog, whatever training Daniel Ward's unit had given him, it hadn't faded. Ghost moved with the silent precision of a soldier. After nearly an hour, Ethan's legs burned, and the snow reached his knees. The forest opened into a narrow ravine, half buried under drifts. Ghost barked once, sharply, and veered toward a gap in the rock face, partially hidden by ice and brush. Ethan followed, slipping through the narrow entrance and into a hollow space beyond. It wasn't much, just a shallow cave, dry enough to block the wind. Ethan set his pack down, breathing hard. He dug through it, pulling out a small survival candle and struck a light. The flame flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows on the rough stone walls. Ghost sank to the ground beside him, sides rising and falling in heavy rhythm. Ethan crouched, checking him quickly. No bleeding, only exhaustion. "You did good," he murmured, his hand resting gently on the dog's neck. The shepherd's eyes flicked open, still alert despite the fatigue. Outside, the wind screamed again, carrying the faint echo of voices, distant but unmistakable. The men were still searching. Ethan leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. His thoughts raced. Someone knew about the chip. Someone had followed the trail here. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. He looked at Ghost, whose eyes gleamed faintly in the candlelight. "They're not after me," he whispered. "They're after what you brought back." The realization settled cold and heavy in his gut. Whatever was on that chip wasn't just classified. It was dangerous enough to kill for. And now, the war he had left behind had found him again, buried under a blizzard's silence. The candlelight trembled, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, snow fell harder, sealing them deeper into the mountain's frozen heart. Ethan reached over and pulled the blanket from his pack, draping it across Ghost's body. "We'll wait it out," he said softly, "just until dawn." The shepherd shifted, pressing closer to his leg, the warmth of his body grounding Ethan's thoughts. He stared at the small flame flickering between them, his jaw set in quiet resolve. For years he'd run from ghosts, but tonight, in a cave buried beneath the Montana snow, he realized there was no outrunning the past, only facing it head-on. And somewhere far below the mountains, buried in data and blood, Operation Black Frost waited to rise again. The highway wound down from the mountains like a vein carved through white bone. Snow still fell in thin, tired flurries as Ethan Cole drove through the silence of early dawn, the hum of the truck's engine his only companion. Ghost lay in the passenger seat, wrapped in a wool blanket, head resting on Ethan's arm. Every few miles, the dog shifted, letting out a faint sigh, and Ethan would glance at him, the faintest trace of worry flickering across his rough features. His face bore the fatigue of sleepless nights, dark stubble covering his jaw, eyes hollow but alive again in a way they hadn't been for years. The old soldier in him had awakened, and now it was leading him straight back into the shadows he'd tried to bury. 3 hours later, the forest thinned, giving way to a small town nestled at the foot of the ridge. The sign at the entrance was nearly swallowed by snow. Red Pine, population 10204. Ethan guided the truck through the empty streets until he spotted a narrow building with a hand-painted sign above the frosted windows. Miller Veterinary Clinic. The place looked modest, a small cabin converted into a clinic, but the sight of it stirred something faintly familiar in him. When he pushed open the door, a bell chimed softly. The smell of antiseptic mingled with the faint, comforting scent of cedar and coffee. Inside, the space was warm, lit by soft lamps and lined with framed photos. Dogs in uniform, handlers in fatigues, black and white snapshots of soldiers posing beside their K-9 partners. Behind the counter stood Dr. Grace Miller, a woman in her mid-40s, tall and slender, with the kind of presence that made silence feel respectful rather than empty. Her hair was tied into a low bun, streaked with silver strands that caught the light like frost. Her face bore gentle lines from years of long hours and quiet sorrow. When she looked up, her gray-green eyes sharpened, eyes that could cut through a lie as easily as they softened at the sight of pain. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm, with a faint rasp that hinted at too many sleepless nights and too much coffee. Ethan nodded slightly, stepping forward with Ghost in his arms. "He needs help," he said simply. For a heartbeat, Grace just stared. Then her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God." She came around the counter, her movements both hurried and hesitant, like someone approaching a ghost they'd only seen in dreams. She crouched beside Ethan, eyes widening as she reached for the dog. Her fingers brushed the matted fur, tracing a faint scar near the shoulder. Her breath caught. "This can't be. This is Ghost." Ethan said nothing. His silence confirmed what she already knew. Grace stood slowly, her expression shifting from disbelief to something deeper. Grief tempered by awe. "I patched this wound myself," she whispered. "Before Black Frost. Daniel said Ghost wouldn't make it, but he did. He always did." Ethan laid Ghost gently on the examination table. Grace slipped on her gloves, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. "You were with Daniel, weren't you?" Ethan nodded once. "He was my brother. Not by blood, but close enough?" Grace gave a small nod, as if the word settled something unspoken between them. "Then you should know," she said quietly. "He didn't die for nothing." She examined the dog carefully, noting old scars along the ribs, burn marks faint beneath the fur, healed fractures near one paw. Her eyes glistened as she spoke softly, half to herself. "They said the unit was wiped out in the explosion. But Ward—" She hesitated. "He triggered the emergency extraction protocol. I think he sent Ghost out before the blast." Ethan's brow furrowed. "With the data chip." Grace looked up sharply. "You found it." He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Grace exhaled slowly, pulling off her gloves. "I should have known. Ward told me once that if things ever went wrong, Ghost would know where to go, that he'd carry what mattered most." "What was on that chip?" Ethan asked, though the question came out more like a demand. Grace hesitated, then crossed to a small cabinet. She took out an old folder, its corners worn and edges stained with coffee. Inside were faded photographs. Men in uniform, a mountain facility half buried in snow, the insignia of Unit 47 stamped across the corner. "Ward's mission was never about recovery," she said. "It was containment. They were sent to shut down a weapons program gone wrong, something they called Project Frostline. When communication went dark, Command erased the files. Every trace of it vanished." Ethan flipped through the photos, his eyes narrowing at the image of a concrete bunker surrounded by ice. "Black Ridge facility?" Grace nodded. "That's the one. They said it collapsed in the explosion, but I never believed that. Too much noise afterward, too many sealed reports." Her eyes met his. "Ward knew something he wasn't supposed to. That's why he sent Ghost away." Ethan's hands tightened around the folder. His voice was low, rough with the weight of memory. "They left him there to die." Grace didn't argue. She just placed a hand on his arm. Steady, deliberate. "He made his choice, Ethan. He stayed so the rest of us could live. But if that chip holds what I think it does, people will kill to keep it buried." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, the firelight from a nearby lamp catching the edges of his eyes. "Then I need to finish what he started." Grace studied him quietly, seeing in his expression the same defiance she'd seen in countless soldiers, men who came home but never really returned. "If you go after this, you'll be going alone. No one's coming to save you." A faint, humorless smile crossed his lips. "Story of my life." Grace sighed softly. "At least let me stabilize him first." She turned back to Ghost, checking his pulse and cleaning the old scars. "He's tougher than he looks," she murmured, "but he won't survive another fight without rest." Ethan watched in silence as her hands moved with practiced care. The sight stirred something he hadn't felt in years: trust. Grace Miller had always been that rare kind of person in the service, efficient under fire, but never hardened by it. She'd once saved Ethan's life after a training explosion in Djibouti. He remembered the same steady voice telling him to breathe while the world burned around them. When she finished, she looked up. "He'll make it," she said quietly. "But Ethan," he met her gaze, "don't underestimate who you're up against. If that chip exposes what they built under Black Ridge, it won't just be ghosts coming after you. It'll be the people who made them." For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and Ghost's slow, steady breathing. Finally, Ethan exhaled, and reached for his coat. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." She gave a faint smile, one corner of her mouth lifting. "I'm not doing it for you," she said. "I'm doing it for Ward, and for him." She nodded towards the shepherd. "He's earned the right to rest." Ethan's jaw tightened, emotion flickering beneath the stoic mask. "Then let's make sure he gets to." He turned toward the door, pausing only once to glance back at the woman and the dog, the last remnants of a story the world had chosen to forget. The snow outside had stopped, the silence almost serene. But Ethan knew peace wouldn't last. It never did. The snow had thickened again by the time the sky began to darken over Red Pine. The air carried the metallic scent of another storm, and the world beyond the clinic window was painted in shades of silver and silence. Inside, the soft hum of old electronics filled the dim room, where Dr. Grace Miller stood hunched over her battered military decryption unit, a relic of another life. Its metal casing was dented, its indicator lights faint, but when she slotted the small, encrypted chip inside, the machine came alive with a low whir, blinking back into relevance like an old soldier called once more to the front. Ethan stood behind her, arms crossed, his shadow stretching across the tiled floor. His expression was unreadable, part patience, part dread. Ghost lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes following every flicker of movement as if he, too, understood what this meant. Lines of data streamed across the small monitor, shifting from gibberish into recognizable coordinates. A satellite image resolved. A jagged stretch of mountains, vast and white, with a single red mark blinking in the heart of the range. Grace squinted. "There," she said, tapping the screen. "North quadrant, sector designation Black Ridge." Ethan leaned closer. "The same name from the files." Grace nodded grimly. "It was supposed to have been sealed after the explosion, but if this is right, someone's still accessing its signal relay." He studied the map. The road leading up to it was barely visible, mostly snow and rock slides, an old supply trail swallowed by winter. "I'll have to go there." Grace turned, her expression sharpening. "You shouldn't go alone." Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "You know better than anyone. I work better alone." "Alone gets you killed," she said flatly. Then softer. "They've already found you once. They'll find you again. Whoever's behind this isn't sending amateurs." He looked down at Ghost, who stirred at the mention of danger. "Then they'll have to go through both of us." Grace exhaled, her voice carrying the weight of quiet resignation. "At least take this." She opened a drawer and pulled out a black satchel. Military issue, worn but sturdy. Inside were medical supplies, 2 signal flares, and a compact communication device. "Old tech. It can't be traced easily." Ethan took it, their eyes meeting for a long, wordless moment. Gratitude lingered between them, unspoken. Then he zipped the pack shut. "If they come here, Grace, burn everything. You were never part of this." She gave a dry laugh. "I was part of this the moment I saved that dog's life 8 years ago." He nodded once, then turned for the door. The wind howled as he stepped into it, Ghost at his heel. For a heartbeat, Grace stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the storm. 2 silhouettes swallowed by white. By late afternoon, the truck's tires were crunching over frozen gravel as Ethan guided it north, deeper into the mountains. The narrow road wound between cliffs like a scar, lined with old military warning signs half buried under ice. The closer he got, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ghost sat upright in the passenger seat now, ears pricked. His fur, once dull, seemed to shimmer faintly in the gray light, an old soldier sensing the battlefield long before it came into view. Yeah, Ethan murmured. We're close. The road ended abruptly at a chain-link fence collapsed under the weight of snow. A faded metal sign hung crookedly. Restricted zone, U.S. property, entry prohibited. Ethan cut the engine and stepped out into the silence. The air bit at his skin, but the adrenaline kept him warm. Ghost jumped down beside him, landing softly, eyes scanning the ridge. They moved on foot, climbing through the wreckage of what once had been a checkpoint. A guardhouse leaned sideways, its windows shattered, its insides frozen in time. A coffee mug still half full, papers scattered across the floor. Ethan's boots crunched through glass and frost as he passed. He didn't look back. By the time they reached the main compound, night had settled over the mountain. The facility loomed ahead, massive and dead, its steel gates warped from the heat of the explosion that had supposedly buried it. Rust clung to everything, and icicles hung like blades from the roof. Ethan pried open a side door with a crowbar and stepped into darkness. The beam from his flashlight cut through the dust, illuminating a narrow corridor lined with old warning labels. Biohazard, authorized personnel only, and near the end, the faded insignia of Unit 47. His heartbeat quickened. Ghost followed close behind, his claws clicking softly against the metal floor. The air inside smelled of rust and old smoke. Ethan swept the light across the walls until it caught a sign that read, Data Control Room, Sector C. He made his way there, every sense alert. The room was half collapsed, computers torn apart by fire and time. But near the far wall, a central server unit remained intact, its casing scorched but operational. Ethan knelt, brushing away a layer of dust. The system still had power. Barely. A single green light blinked faintly on the panel. He pulled out a portable drive from his satchel, connected it, and began the transfer. The screens flickered to life with old logs, transaction records, encrypted emails, shipment manifests. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the files. Names, coordinates, and corporate accounts, millions transferred to offshore banks tied to Branford Dynamics, a weapons contractor known for its government deals. But one signature stood out at the bottom of every approval. Colonel Mason Dreyer, Commanding Officer, Operation Black Frost. Ethan's jaw tightened. Dreyer. The same man who'd given Ward's team their final orders. The same man who'd called off the rescue and declared them unrecoverable. Rage coiled deep in his chest, but he forced it down. He copied the files to the drive and slipped it into his inner pocket. A faint sound echoed through the corridor behind him. The crunch of boots on metal. Ethan froze, then extinguished his flashlight. He pressed his back to the console, listening. The noise grew louder. Slow, deliberate steps, followed by the mechanical hum of engines outside. Through the shattered window he saw beams of light slicing through the snow. Headlights, a convoy. They tracked the chip, he whispered. Ghost growled low in his throat. Ethan drew his pistol, the familiar weight grounding him. The first burst of gunfire shattered the glass behind him, spraying shards across the console. He ducked, rolling behind a steel desk. The gunfire intensified, echoing down the corridor in sharp metallic bursts. "Come on, boy," he hissed. Ghost bolted beside him as Ethan fired back, short, precise bursts aimed at the light sources. He hit one. Sparks exploded as a flashlight went dark. Then came shouting, more boots, the hiss of smoke grenades. Ethan's pulse slowed, not from calm, but from focus. Every instinct from his years in combat surged to the surface. He moved like a shadow between the machines, firing only when necessary, every motion economical, practiced. Ghost lunged once, taking down a man who had slipped too close, dragging him into the dark with a snarl that echoed like something primal. When the gunfire paused, Ethan crouched low beside Ghost, reloading. Through the flicker of muzzle flashes outside, he saw their attackers, black-clad men, faces hidden behind masks, the insignia on their shoulders unmarked. Mercenaries. "Looks like Dreyer still has friends," he muttered. Ghost's eyes glimmered amber in the dark, steady, fearless. Ethan exhaled slowly and pulled the pin on a flash grenade from his belt. "We're not dying here," he said, voice quiet but certain. "Not like they did." He tossed the grenade, the explosion lighting the corridor in blinding white. The mercenaries shouted, disoriented. Ethan rose with the precision of a man who'd lived through too many wars and moved forward, toward the snow, the gunfire, and the truth that refused to stay buried. The storm had swallowed the mountain whole. Wind screamed through broken steel and torn insulation, turning the ruined base into a frozen grave. The temperature had dropped to lethal degrees, but Ethan Cole barely felt it. His breath came in sharp clouds as he crouched behind a rusted bulkhead, Beretta in hand, his body low and still as a predator. The faint red light from a shattered warning beacon painted streaks across his face, highlighting the sweat that mixed with melting frost on his skin. His expression was carved from the same iron as the world around him. Cold, focused, ready. Ghost crouched beside him, one paw stiff from old injury, his fur slicked with snow and grime. The old shepherd's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, every inhale a battle. His once glossy coat was now a patchwork of silver and black, scarred by years of war and neglect. Yet his amber eyes remained bright, glowing faintly in the dark. The low rumble of truck engines cut through the storm, followed by the mechanical click of boots crunching on snow. Ethan adjusted his grip on the pistol, his other hand tightening around a combat knife strapped to his thigh. He could feel the vibration through the floor plates, multiple hostiles moving in formation. He muttered under his breath. "They brought an army." The steel door at the far end of the corridor shuddered under a heavy kick. Then another. Bolts screeched and tore loose. Ethan braced. The door flew open, slamming against the wall. 3 beams of flashlight cut through the dark. Ethan fired twice before the first order could be shouted. 2 sharp cracks, clean and final. The first man fell before he hit the ground. The second stumbled, clutching his throat. Muzzle flashes lit the narrow hall like lightning trapped underground. Bullets pinged off metal and bit into the walls. Ethan moved between cover points in a blur, a ghost among ghosts. "Ghost, left flank," he barked. The shepherd darted from the shadows, his movements fluid despite his age. He lunged at a gunman taking aim from the stairwell, jaws locking on the man's arm with terrifying precision. The mercenary screamed, firing wildly, bullets sparking off the floor as Ghost's weight dragged him down. Ethan rose, fired once, and the noise stopped. The next wave came harder, 5, maybe 6 men. One hurled a flashbang through the doorway. Ethan saw the small silver sphere bounce once across the concrete, and his instincts took over. He yanked Ghost back, throwing himself behind the wall just as the grenade detonated. A white blast seared his vision, followed by ringing silence. He blinked furiously, blinking away the blindness, every nerve screaming for focus. Shapes moved in the haze, silhouettes of rifles and tactical helmets. Ethan raised his weapon, but before he could fire, a single bark tore through the deafening void. Ghost charged again, not for blood, but for instinct. Pure and unbreakable. He collided with one of the Hu soldiers, throwing him off balance. Another mercenary turned, shouting, "Take the dog down!" Ethan's body moved before the thought formed. He stepped into the open, firing 3 rounds in quick succession. One hit the light on the gunman's chest, shattering it into sparks. Another found its mark in the man's shoulder, spinning him into the wall. The smell of gunpowder filled the corridor, thick and choking. Ethan's ears rang from the noise, but his mind was a calm storm. He reloaded in 2 seconds flat, sliding the magazine home with the precision of a man who'd done it in his sleep 1,000 times. A shadow loomed to his right, taller, heavier, with a shotgun raised. The man's face was hidden beneath a balaclava, but his stance was military. Ethan ducked behind a broken crate just as the shotgun roared, the blast tearing splinters into the air. Ethan rolled sideways, came up on one knee, and shot twice into the man's ribs. Silence fell for a heartbeat, the kind that always comes before the final breath of chaos. Then the storm screamed again. Ethan turned and saw it. Ghost stood halfway down the corridor, his muzzle stained dark. One of the mercenaries, still half conscious, raised his pistol. Ethan opened his mouth to shout, but the sound was lost in the wind. The gun fired. The bullet hit Ghost in the side. The shepherd staggered, his legs folding beneath him. Ethan's world went soundless again, not from shock, but from the sudden, hollow void that opened inside his chest. He sprinted to the dog's side, sliding on his knees across the blood-slick floor. Ghost lay trembling, breath short and ragged. The fur around the wound darkened fast. Ethan pressed his palm to the injury, trying to stop the bleeding, his gloved hands shaking. "Stay with me, Ghost," he whispered, his voice breaking despite the steel in it. "Come on, boy. You're not done yet." Ghost's eyes met his. Steady, calm. There was no panic, only recognition. The same gaze Ethan had seen years ago in Daniel Ward's eyes when everything had gone to hell. A soldier's acceptance. Ethan swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. No, not this time. Outside, the sound of rotors began to rise, a deep, thunderous beat cutting through the storm. Lights flashed across the shattered windows. Through the distant echo of engines came the faint crackle of radio chatter. Grace's voice filtered faintly through the old comm clipped to Ethan's vest. "Ethan, we've got federal units inbound. Hold your position." He exhaled a shuddering breath, relief and grief tangled in one. Reinforcements. Finally. The remaining mercenaries, realizing they'd lost the advantage, began to fall back toward the trucks. One fired a final round over his shoulder before disappearing into the storm. Ethan ignored them. The fight was over. For now. He lifted Ghost carefully into his arms, the dog's weight lighter than he remembered. The heat of his blood seeping through Ethan's jacket. The storm howled louder, but it couldn't drown out the faint, labored rhythm of Ghost's breathing. Outside, flashing blue and red lights cut through the whiteness. Black SUVs and armored vehicles pulled into the compound, tires grinding against ice. Federal agents fanned out with rifles raised, shouting commands Ethan barely heard. A woman in tactical gear ran up. A field medic, young, pale-faced, her breath forming clouds in the cold. "Sir, let me—" Ethan shook his head, eyes locked on the shepherd. "No, he's done enough." He sank to one knee in the snow, lowering Ghost gently onto the ground. Snowflakes settled on the dog's muzzle, melting into tiny beads of water. Ethan stroked his head, voice barely above a whisper. "You did it, partner. You finished the mission." Ghost's tail twitched once, then stillness. The old soldier was gone. Ethan stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the storm, holding what was left of his last tie to the past. Around him, the world blurred into motion. Agents shouting, the sound of engines, the hum of radio static. But none of it reached him. Grace's voice came again through the comm, softer now. "Ethan, it's over." He looked down at Ghost's peaceful face, the faintest smile ghosting across his own. "No," he said quietly. "It's just beginning." Snow continued to fall, thick and relentless, covering blood, tracks, and bodies alike. It erased everything, except memory. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole let himself grieve. Spring came late to Montana that year. The snow melted slowly, reluctant to leave the valleys it had ruled for so long. The mountains, once buried under white silence, now shimmered with threads of green where grass pushed through thawing soil. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, a scent of rebirth. At the edge of a wide meadow stood a small ranch with a white fence and a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "Ghosts Haven." The paint was still fresh, the letters slightly uneven, Ethan's handiwork. A light breeze stirred it, carrying the sound of distant barking. Ethan Cole stepped out from the barn, his frame broad against the morning light. His hair had grown longer, touched with silver at the temples. A faint scar still traced his jaw, a souvenir from Black Ridge. But his eyes, once hollow and wary, now held a quiet steadiness. He wore a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, jeans faded from work, and heavy boots caked in mud. The soldier had turned builder, though the discipline in his movements never left. Beyond the fence, dogs ran across the pasture, shepherds, retrievers, labs, each one a survivor of war, retired from service but not from purpose. They barked, played, and sometimes limped on prosthetic legs, their joy unbroken by what they'd endured. From the porch, Dr. Grace Miller watched them with folded arms. She was dressed in a light brown coat, her gray-streaked hair loose for once. The years had softened her sharpness, but not her resolve. She turned as Ethan approached, handing him a cup of coffee. "You're officially a civilian now," she said, smiling faintly. "Running a dog sanctuary. That's a long way from covert operations and classified data." Ethan took the cup, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. "Feels strange, quieter, but maybe that's what I've been chasing all along." Grace nodded. "You're doing something good here, Ethan. These dogs, they needed someone who understood." He glanced at the fields. "They understand more than most people ever will." Near the old maple tree, Ghost, the aging shepherd, lay stretched beneath its shade, eyes half closed, nose twitching to the spring air. His fur had turned mostly white now, the black markings only faint shadows of what they once were. He was thinner, slower, but his eyes still glowed with that unshakable light, the same look that had led Ethan through blizzards and gunfire. Grace followed Ethan's gaze. "He's holding on," she said quietly. "He's earned the right to rest." They stood in silence for a while, sipping coffee as the wind rustled the trees. Birds sang somewhere distant, their calls faint but clear. Later that afternoon, Grace returned from town carrying a small envelope, the paper yellowed and edges frayed. Her expression was thoughtful, her movements deliberate. Ethan noticed the weight in her step as she crossed the porch. "What's that?" he asked. She handed it to him. "They declassified the Black Frost files last week. The military sent this. It was found in the archives. Addressed to you." Ethan turned the envelope over in his hands. The handwriting was rough but unmistakable. "Daniel Ward," he whispered. He sat on the porch steps, the sun warm against his back, and carefully unfolded the letter. The ink had faded, the words uneven where the pen had trembled, a soldier writing in haste, maybe on the eve of the mission that took his life. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means things went the way we feared. Don't waste your guilt on what you couldn't stop. You were the best of us. You always were. If I don't make it home, find Ghost. He'll know what to do. He always does. He won't lead you back to a base or a war. He'll lead you somewhere better. Somewhere you can believe in again. Daniel." Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter. The words blurred for a moment before he blinked them clear. Grace sat beside him. "He knew you'd survive," she said softly. "He trusted you to carry what he couldn't." Ethan nodded, voice rough. "I just wish he'd made it back to see this place." Grace's lips curved faintly. "He did, Ethan. Every nail, every fence post, every dog that finds peace here. That's his legacy too." As the sun began to sink, turning the sky gold, Ethan walked toward the old tree. Ghost stirred at his approach, tail wagging weakly. Ethan knelt beside him, the grass warm beneath his knees. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "We did it. It's all over." Ghost lifted his head, eyes half-lidded, and let out a low, contented bark, soft, almost like a sigh. Ethan smiled through the tightness in his throat and reached out, resting his hand gently on the dog's head. "You brought me home, didn't you?" The wind swept across the field, carrying the scent of pine and life renewed. Somewhere behind them, other dogs barked playfully. Grace watched from the porch, a faint smile ghosting her lips. Ghost's breathing slowed, peaceful, steady. Ethan stayed with him until the last trace of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills. When the night came, he lit the lantern by the porch, letting its glow spill across the field, a beacon for every soul that had once known darkness. Months later, Ghost's Haven became more than a sanctuary. Soldiers visited, some broken, some healing, and found quiet there. Ethan taught them how to work with the dogs, how to rebuild trust. Grace handled the therapy programs, strict yet kind, her voice steady as always. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, when the mist hung low over the grass, Ethan would swear he still heard Ghost's bark echo through the valley. Not mournful, but guiding. He'd look toward the horizon, smile faintly, and whisper, "We're home now, Ghost." Above the ranch, the sky stretched endless and blue, the kind of blue only seen after the longest winter. The dawn of faith had finally come. In the end, Ethan's story reminds us that miracles don't always arrive with thunder and light. They come quietly, through loyalty, courage, and love that refuses to fade. Ghost was more than a dog. He was a vessel of grace, a reminder that even in our darkest winters, God never stops guiding us home. In every act of kindness, every soul we choose to save, the Lord's light shines again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and may God bless and protect everyone watching, now and always.